Take a break at this time, but I hope with your indulgence, you don't have to do this. There are lots of you here. We've got a very special second guest who we want to listen to and also question, and we just got an hour. So, Greg, without further ado.
Thank you. It is a delight to be here. It's so impressive to see so many people come out to listen to two nerdy economists. One of my colleagues at Harvard likes to point out that being an economist during a time of economic troubles is a little bit like being an undertaker during a plague. Times are sad, but business is good. Now, it says up there that I am an advisor to Mitt Romney, which is correct. So I should probably start with a caveat. During the primaries, there was a debate, well, the Bloomberg debate actually, where somebody asked Mitt Romney, what economists do you talk to? And Mitt was nice enough to mention me. His very next sentence was, but of course I don't agree with everything he says, which was a very wise thing to say, because I have many opinions that would make it very hard for someone to get elected to any office. And so I should be clear that today I'm speaking for myself and not Mitt Romney, and indeed I'm sure it'll be pretty clear to you a few points that speaking opinions that only a tenured professor could possibly hold. Okay, what I'd like to do is to set the stage of talking about fiscal policy is to move away from economics for a second, talk about an example from medicine. Let's imagine you're a physician and a patient comes into your office and he's pretty darn sick. And you look at his symptoms, and they look somewhat familiar. You've seen similar cases before, but you've never seen a case exactly like this before. And you're a little confused about exactly what he has and exactly what remedy would be best. Now, if you're a medical researcher, it's very clear what you would do. You try to get 100 patients like this and come up with some proposed remedy. You'd have 50 of them the proposed remedy, you have 50 of them a placebo, and then watch to see whether the people with the remedy did better than people with the placebo. But if you're a practicing doctor, you probably don't have 100. You just have one guy, and you can't tell him to go away and find 99 patients just like him. What you have to do is take your best shot. So what do? Well, you use your years of judgment, you use your education, and you take a guess about what's ailing the patient, and you take a guess about what remedy would work. You give the patient some medicine, you say, come back next week, let's see how you're doing. The patient comes back next week, and he's sicker than he was when you saw him a week earlier. Similar symptoms, just worse. What do? Do you say, I guess my original diagnosis was wrong, and I gave him the wrong remedy, and I should try something else? Or do you say, I guess he was sicker than I thought, I better double the dose? And if you think about that question, you realize that either possibility could be right. It's actually a very difficult epistemological question. Just because he got sicker doesn't mean that you were wrong at the beginning. You could be wrong, but you only have one guy. You don't have the 50 other people with the placebo. You only have the one guy. And the reason I like to posit that hypothetical is it's pretty much a situation that macroeconomists face. We don't get to observe 100 economies that are all similar and get to give 50 of them some sort of fiscal policy and 50 of them a placebo. We get one economy, and we give them the one remedy that we think is going to work, and we just see what's going to happen. So the Obama administration came in, and the economy was in pretty bad shape, for sure. And they did a forecast of what would happen. They said, look, if we don't do anything, the unemployment rate is going to go up to 9%. But if we pass the stimulus package that we put together, about $800 billion, we can keep the unemployment rate below 8%. Well, they passed the stimulus package, and the unemployment rate went to 10%. And if you look at where we are now, with unemployment above 8%, it is higher than they said it would be with the stimulus package. And indeed, they said it's higher than it would have been if they had done nothing. Because they predicted with the stimulus would be a little below 6 by now, and without the stimulus would be a little above 6. And we're substantially above that. Now, just like the doctor, there's two possible interpretations. One is that the diagnosis and remedy was wrong, and the other was the economy was just sicker than they thought it was when they came into office. and maybe they didn't give a big enough dose. And I think that really is a very hard question to answer. I have my own guesses, and the Obama administration economists have their own guesses, and they're somewhat different guesses, but I want to be very clear that there's no definitive way, with only one observation, with one economy, to know for sure. Now, Team Obama relied on a very traditional Keynesian theory. John Maynard Keynes, the great British economist, wrote in the 1930s, the famous book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. And that the idea that evolved from Keynes's book, 1930s, find its way into lots of mainstream macroeconometric models. So pieces like the Federal Reserve and the Council of Economic Advisors and many private firms maintain computer simulation models of the economy based on these Keynesian ideas. And what the Obama administration did is they simulated a very mainstream Keynesian model, and they came up with what economists call fiscal policy multipliers. And they concluded that for every dollar of extra government spending, GDP would rise by $1.57. For every dollar of tax cuts, GDP would rise by 99 cents. And they concluded from this that what we really need is more spending, government spending, in order to prop up the economy. And Larry Summers made the case for that today. Well, two things to say about that kind of analysis. First, it's very standard. There's nothing outlandish about it. I teach it in that Keynesian analysis when I teach introductory economics at Harvard. I teach Ec 10, the large introductory course. But the other thing I tell my students is, while this is a theory that's out there, it's not a universally agreed upon theory. You know, when I teach economics to freshmen, it's a year-long course, and one of the structural principles that we use to sort of organize topics is we start off on the stuff that economists are most certain about. Economists are really certain that to maximize profit and equate marginal revenue equals marginal cost. 100 years from now, we're absolutely going to be teaching that. One of the last things we teach in the course is the Keynesian theory of the business cycle. Because while it is a very prominent theory and very important for students to understand, it's very controversial among economists. And I want students to think about that. So what that means is that we economists have to be very humble when we talk about policy. Because the Keynesian analysis could be right or it could be wrong, and the truth is we don't really know for sure. Now, the big question that I think divides the parties to some degree is, to what extent should we use government spending, and to what extent should we use tax policy to stimulate an economy in recession? George Bush, when he came into office, relied on, it was also inherited an economy that was heading into recession. And after the internet bubble was collapsing, as you recall, and he used tax policy to try to stimulate the economy. After the housing bubble, Barack Obama inherited a much sicker economy, for sure, but also went in recession, and decided to use more in the government spending side. And so there's now a raging debate among professional economists as to what extent should we rely on tax policy, and to what extent should we rely on government spending to stimulate an economy that finds itself in recession. It was mentioned earlier, the research by Alberto Alessino, my colleague at Harvard, and what Alberto Alessino with several co-authors finds is that tax policy is perhaps a more potent tool for stimulating an economy in recession than is government spending. Now, as Larry pointed out, Alberto's work is based on looking at international experience, looking at the experiences of different countries over different points of time. And the situation we find ourselves now is not exactly the same as various European countries at various points in the past. So it's not clear to what extent you can extrapolate past experience to the situation we face right now. And so we face a situation now where we sort of rely on historical evidence, the Alessino research, but recognizing that it doesn't quite apply to the situation we face. The situation we face is different along several dimensions, in particular the zero bound on interest rates. Or we can say, well, we don't really have a lot of historical examples to study the zero bound on interest rates, so let's rely on the Keynesian theory as it's been developed over the years and assume that that theory is right. And that is sort of the situation we face, and there's no easy answer. So that's all actually I want to say about the short-run fiscal policy. I think if the Republicans had been in charge, we would have seen more of an emphasis on tax policy rather than government spending to try to stimulate the economy. And I think economists today debate which of the two tools is more useful. In fact, I have an economics textbook. In the last chapter, I have debates among macroeconomists, things that we just don't understand. I present the pros and cons, and the most recent edition, I added a new debate on should we use tax policy or government spending to stimulate an economy in recession. I think there are plausible arguments on both sides. Let me turn from the short-run macroeconomic picture to the long-run macroeconomic picture. Can I write on the blackboard? Am I allowed to use the blackboard? Okay, I'm going to write a sentence with 2 blanks, and I want you to fill in the blanks with the words short and long. Okay. Take care of the blank run, and the blank run will take care of itself. So if you have to put the words short and long in that sentence, how would you put them? Now this is a the test actually that goes back to Charlie Schultz, who wrote about this in the American Economic Review. Charlie Schultz was an economic advisor to Jimmy Carter, a long time economist at the Brookings Institution when he was in government. Anyway, what Charlie said was that you could tell a Republican, or particularly a conservative, I guess as he really said, not a Republican, but a conservative from a liberal economist, how they complete the sentence. The liberals, Charlie said, he was one, by the way, said, take care of the short run, the long run will take care of itself. As long as we sort of keep the economy at full employment all the time, sort of worry about short run aggregate demand, then they will have a good long run growth trajectory. And Republicans, conservatives are more likely to say, take care of the long run, the short run will take care of itself. As we create good long run fundamentals, so that the long run looks good, people will feel more confident in the short run that'll help maintain full employment even in the short run. Now, the truth is, economists of all stripes say we need to focus on both the long run and the short run. And I think Larry Summers and I would completely agree with that. But I think Charlie's also right that when you read conservatives and liberals, you see more of an emphasis on short run, things like maintaining full employment in the short run or through the business cycle, more emphasis on that. And if you listen to the more conservative economists, or more likely to be advising Republican candidates, they tend to focus more on what are the policies that will promote long-run economic growth in the long-run picture. So I think that's sort of, it's oversimplified, but I think a useful perspective to sort of try to understand the differences between two economists like Larry and myself who agree on lots of things and how our emphasis tends to be a little different. So what are the long-run issues that we face as a country? To oversimplify it slightly, I think there's 2 big issues. One is that we might become Greece, the other is that we might become France. So let me explain to you what I mean by those two risks. By Greece, I mean that we really, as Larry said very well, we have large budget deficits, larger than we've ever experienced in this country, other than like World War II, major war. We have budget deficits, large budget deficits that are not going to go away unless there's a major change in fiscal policy. And if we just continue along this trajectory as we are, without any change, the debt to GDP ratio keeps rising. At some point, people say, no, these guys are nuts. They're not going to repay their debts. The bond market runs on us, and that's when we become Greece. Economist Rudy Dornbush used to like to say that financial crises like that take longer to materialize than you might think, but then when they happen faster than you ever could have expected. So right now, the bond markets are trusting us. They think we'll eventually do the right thing. I mean, as Winston Churchill once said, Americans always do the right thing after exhausting all their alternatives. And we're in the process of exhausting the alternatives right now. The bond market thinks we'll eventually prove Churchill right. Now, okay, so we have the dire long-term picture, and Larry said it well. There's basically 2 things going on. We're aging as a society, where people are living longer, having fewer children, so a higher and higher percentage of the population is a group that's eligible for Social Security, Medicare, and even Medicaid to the extent it serves the poor elderly population. And the relative price of health care is rising over time. And those two trends predate this recession has been going on for a very, very, very long time, but the recession sort of has made things worse. But though these things, even if we achieve full employment tomorrow, these trends are still going to make the long-term fiscal picture very difficult to deal with. Now, as Larry mentioned, President Obama appointed the Bowles-Simpson Commission to help deal with this. I actually think Bowles-Simpson did a far, far better job than I expected them to. I thought they actually did a terrific job. Not perfect. They kind of punted on Medicare, and they actually didn't propose any significant Medicare reforms. But a lot of the reforms they did propose were quite significant and quite sensible. So in Social Security, they proposed changing some indexation rules in order to reduce benefits for the high-income beneficiaries. They talked about raising the retirement age. I think that makes a lot of sense. That's one of the issues, by the way, that polls much better among economists than among the general public. The economists must like their jobs. But raising the retirement age is something that economists think is actually a very sensible solution to the entitlements problem, asking people to work a little longer. Indeed, if they had indexed the age of eligibility for these programs to life expectancy when these programs were put in place, the problem now we face would be vastly smaller. But the general public doesn't like that idea at all. But I think it's one of those ideas that we'll eventually have to come to realize is pretty important. Bowles-Simpson also proposed significant tax reform, and indeed, if you look at tax reformers, you see that there's a large commonality among them. If you look at what Bowles-Simpson proposed, or look at what the President Bush's Tax Reform Commission proposed, I don't know, 6 or 7 years earlier, there's more commonality than there are differences. The basic mantra of tax reform is broaden the base and lower rates. And it is get rid of what some of these people call loopholes, but to be more precise, they're exclusions and deductions, and use the revenue from that to lower rates, and maybe get some revenue out of it so then lower rates enough. But both the President Bush's and President Obama's commissions both said if you broaden the base enough, you could get rates down quite significantly. Now, ultimately, how we do that is a long political process. It's a process that's going to mainly take place in Congress. The House Ways and Means Committee is going to play a very important role, and there'll be a lot of negotiation between the House and the Senate and who's ever president in a few months as to what kind of exclusions and deductions we want to take on. Now, let me give you my personal preferences. There's a lot of them out there, but for every loophole, there's somebody who views this as a completely valid deduction or exclusion. And so therefore we need to debate them one at a time. And I think even if I have my favorite, I'm willing to give up some of my favorites if we can sort of all agree to sort of chip in a little bit of our favorites in order to make a more rational tax system. So let me start with one. Mortgage interest deduction. It's one of the biggest ones. The mortgage interest deduction. Obviously, you're a homeowner, you like the mortgage interest deduction. I like the mortgage interest deduction for myself personally. And you can deduct interest on up to $1 million mortgage. I have about $1 million mortgage. So I get a nice big tax deduction for this. But if you think about it, even though it benefits me, there's not a lot of rational basis for it from the standpoint of how policy wonks think about it. It's not particularly efficient in the sense that it encourages more of the nation's capital to go into housing relative to corporate capital, where it creates jobs and productivity. So more of our savings gets funneled into housing as opposed to, say, plants and equipment. And there's a lot of this various studies that show that tends to reduce productivity in the country. So it's not efficient. But is it equitable? You might say, well, fine, it's not efficient, but there's lots of goals in tax policy, not just efficiency, but also equity. Well, is it equitable? Well, why should renters subsidize homeowners? Homeowners tend to be richer on average than renters. I like the subsidy for myself personally, but it's hard for me to look at these people who are typically poorer than either average renter in downtown Boston and think, oh yes, they should be paying higher taxes so I can get my mortgage subsidy. So I think it fails this test of both efficiency and equity, but it'll be a very hard political sell to convince many homeowners and in particular many realtors that the mortgage interest deduction should go. State and local tax deduction. On your federal taxes, there's a deduction for state and local taxes. Then you might ask yourself, is there a good policy reason why high tax states and cities should get a subsidy from the low tax states and states and cities. Now, I think every state and city should be able to vote on its own how much public services they want, how high taxes they want. But I don't personally see a case why some cities should be subsidizing other cities based on those personal policy preferences. So if one city decides to have a public pool, another city says, oh, we're going to have lower taxes without a public pool, and if you want a pool, you can go to join a private club. Well, those are two different choices that two different cities should be able to make, and there's no reason that one city should subsidize the other city's decision. So I would get rid of this deduction for state and local taxes. Health insurance exclusion. If your employer decides that as part of your compensation package, he's going to give you auto insurance, you're not going to get a tax rate for that. The value of that auto insurance is going to be taxable compensation to you, because it is compensation to you. On the other hand, if we gave you a tax rate for that, we said, no, auto insurance you get through your employer is not taxable compensation, well, everybody would get their auto insurance through their employer, and the auto insurance would start being really generous auto insurance. I mean, it wouldn't just cover crashes, it would cover oil changes. It would cover everything. You go to the gas station and say, well, I've got my insurance card's picking that up. And your auto insurance would cover too much. Well, we have a situation now, really for historical, accidental reasons, where health insurance provided by employers is excluded from the tax base. And as a result, people probably get too much of their compensation in the form of health insurance relative to cash compensation. And it has affected our health system. So those, I think, are the three that I would put on top of my list of things I would like to look at very hard. You can still eliminate them completely, or you can scale them back. So for example, mortgage interest deduction. So right now, a $1 million mortgage. Middle class person making $50,000 a year does not have a $1 million mortgage. I don't think it would really hurt anybody's view of equity to reduce a $1 million mortgage subsidy to a $500,000 mortgage, or $300,000 mortgage. People having mortgages that large are the top few percent of the income distribution. So we could either eliminate it completely, which a lot of economists would favor, or we could sort of scale it back. And that's true with all of these deductions. Now let me mention a couple of deductions that I like. I like the charitable interest deduction. I think it does let 1,000 points of light, to use an old expression that some people here might be familiar with. I think it has 1,000 points of light to shine. I also happen to work at a charitable institution, so maybe I'm self-interested in saying that. I like the charitable deduction. I tend to like savings incentives like individual retirement accounts, because it moves our income tax towards a little bit more of a consumption tax, and I think that's a good thing for various reasons. But I would be willing to chip in one of those I like. We could all get together and chip in the ones you like, and sort of broaden the base a lot and get substantially lower tax rates. I think that would be great. Now, one of the other ideas that Bowles Simpson proposed, which also thought was terrific, is a higher gasoline tax. There's actually a great article today in the New York Times about gasoline taxes and comparing gasoline taxes to mileage standards. So I'm not going on for a lot, but go read that article. I strongly recommend it. I think it's the front page of the business section. Bowles Simpson said we should have a 15-cent increase in the federal gasoline tax. That, in my view, is much too small. I've written several things. You go to our website, you can find them, about the virtues of higher gasoline taxes. There's all sorts of negative externalities, bad side effects associated with gasoline consumption. Whether it's climate change, congestion, accidents, there's all sorts of reasons why, from a social standpoint, it'd be great if people drove less. How do you get people to drive less? You raise the price of driving. Now, when economists try to add up all the adverse side effects associated with driving, try to figure out what an optimal gasoline tax is, they estimate it's be a little over $2 a gallon. Compared to the current gasoline tax, which is about 40 cents a gallon. So adding 15 cents, as Bowles Simpson did, is a step in the right direction, but much too modest. And I'd like to see something quite a bit larger. If we have time, we'll talk later about, if there's a question about the corporate tax. I know there is a consensus now in both parties, I think, that the corporate tax rates probably need to be cut. Both President Obama and Mitt Romney have suggested cutting the statutory tax rate, corporate tax rate. We have one of the highest in the OECD, and so I think there's a good reason to cut it. There's complicated issues about offshore accounts, as Larry talked about. I won't talk about some other things, so I won't go down there, but there is, I think, important difference between President Obama and Mitt Romney on how the corporate income tax will work for multinational corporations, but that's kind of an arcane thing that I won't go into today. But I do want to talk about healthcare, because as I mentioned, healthcare is one of those areas that that's crucial to policy because the price of healthcare has been growing over time, and it's one of the things driving these very large budget deficits. Well, what are the approaches to dealing with healthcare? There's basically two approaches out there. This is what I think of as the top-down approach and the bottom-up approach. The top-down approach is embodied in President Obama's healthcare reform bill. He established something called the Independent Payment Advisory Board. And what that is, it's a group of doctors, health economists, other policy wonks, to look at the healthcare system and try to figure out what should we be paying for and what shouldn't we be paying for. So the idea is to have experts try to rationalize the system from the top. Really smart guys studying the system, try to figure out where are we wasting money. The bottom-up approach, which is implicit in Paul Ryan's premium support model, is to say, look, we can't have sort of top-down central planners telling people what to do. Let's unleash the forces of choice and competition by changing Medicare into a system where everybody gets a certain amount of premium dollars from the government that they can then use to buy healthcare in a competitive exchange. And indeed, the Ryan vision of what Medicare would be is a little bit like the health exchanges set up for people under 65 under President Obama's healthcare bill. So I think that those are the two models out there, bottom up, top down. Let me actually put a note of pessimism in here. I think it's very possible that neither of these approaches is going to work. That is, the implicit assumption that both parties have is that there's a way to reduce the growth of healthcare costs without significantly compromising health outcomes and health care. That's the implicit assumption. The only difference is how do we do that? Let me suggest a more pessimistic view. Maybe, this is a little bit of optimism in this, but from a budgetary standpoint, it's purely pessimistic. Maybe the reason healthcare costs are rising over time has nothing to do with inefficiency per se, but rather has to do with technology. And what technology is doing is creating more and better ways to prolong and enhance life. Those technological innovations are wonderful. They do increase our life expectancy. I take a statin. My father died of a heart attack. I'm hoping to live a few hours longer than he did because they invented statins, but they cost money. And similarly, everything we do is making our life, in healthcare that we didn't have a generation ago, is making our life better. Not everything, but many of the things we do is making our life better, but they cost us money. There's been some research, particularly I'm thinking of some research by Robert Hall and Chad Jones at Stanford, that suggests that over time, healthcare spending will continue rising as a percentage of GDP. Whereas a generation ago, or two ago, it was 5% of GDP, now it's 15 or 17% of GDP. They predict that a generation or two from now will be 30% of GDP. And they say that's not a problem. That's not a problem because after a while, we run into diminishing margin utility of lots of stuff. You don't really need a bigger house. You don't need more bathrooms. You don't need a smaller and smaller iPod. At some point, those physical things run into diminishing margin utility, but very few people run into diminishing margin utility for years of life. People want to say, I've had enough. Thanks very much. I'll go buy another bathroom for my house instead. Years of life, something that does not run into diminishing margin utility very fast. So maybe it makes sense as we get richer as a society to spend a higher and higher percentage of GDP on healthcare. So that's the good news, that we're going to probably live longer and longer over time because of advances in technology. But that raises the question of how are we going to pay for it? How are we going to pay for it? And let me close with a hypothetical I like to give my students. And I'll take questions on anything I said, or anything I didn't say. Let me give you a hypothetical. I want you to imagine new healthcare technology. This is the perfect healthcare technology. I'm going to call it the Dorian Gray pill. Those of you who haven't read Oscar Wilde's book, Dorian Gray is about this. The portrait of Dorian Gray is about this guy. That's a portrait that ages for him, and he never has to age. Now, the way the Dorian Gray pill works is the following: you take one of these pills a day, and you will not get sick. You will not die. You will not age. You stay exactly. It's perfect healthcare technology. Perfect. The problem is it's very expensive to manufacture. It costs, you can say, $150,000 a year to get a year's supply. So if you really want to live forever, at your current age, perfect health, it costs you $150,000 a year. Now what does that mean? Well, it means that some people can live forever. That's gonna be pretty cool. If you make $500,000 a year, then you spend $150 to live forever. I'd be perfectly happy to spend a third of my income to live forever. But we have a society where the average income is only $40,000 to $50,000 a year. So obviously we can't give everyone the Dorian Gray pills. So if we invent such a technology, how would we allocate that? This would be a great science fiction movie, by the way. So you have people like Bill Gates. There's no question Bill Gates could live forever. It's just pocket change for him, right? And even lots of very successful corporate lawyers could live forever. But the average person couldn't. How would we choose to allocate that as a society? Would we say, I'm sorry, this is not fair, so nobody gets it? Would we say, well, if you can afford it, you can get it, otherwise not? And the reason I think it's a useful hypothetical to think about, it's not going to happen anytime soon, but it is slowly the economy that we're evolving toward. That healthcare is getting better and more expensive. And we're going to have to come to grips with the fact of how much are we going to value equality in healthcare outcomes and enforce equality versus allowing for inequality, recognizing that healthcare is getting more and more expensive. And that, I fear, is really the big question that the next generation is going to face as healthcare gets to be a larger and larger percentage of GDP. So I'm sorry to end on sort of a downer, but I'm sure I'll have some really great questions, so I'll try to be a little more upbeat during the Q&A. Thank you very much.